My daughter told me I was too embarrassing to be seen with her on vacation, and she said it like she was doing me a favor. I had spent 30 years putting her first, paying for her comfort, her mistakes, and her future, and in one sentence, she erased me. So I didn't argue, I didn't beg, and I didn't warn her before I canceled the one thing her entire life was quietly standing on. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales, because this story proves it. I had always thought vacations were a chance to escape, to spend time with family, to laugh, and to leave the world behind for a week or two. Over the years, my daughter Jessica and I had taken countless little trips together when she was younger. Weekends at the lake, ski trips, or even those short city breaks she would beg for whenever school was out. I had loved every single one, even when she was moody or I was tired. Those trips had been my chance to feel close to her, to be part of her life. But last week, I realized I hadn't truly been part of her life in a long time. It started on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through my emails, when a notification from the family group chat popped up. Usually, these chats were harmless, funny memes, family announcements, or pictures of her new house. But this time, I noticed a thread titled, "Family Trip Details." My curiosity piqued. I opened it, expecting to see something mundane. At first glance, everything looked cheerful enough. The messages were full of excitement. Dates, itineraries, hotel confirmations, and planning notes about flights. Then I noticed something odd. Every single family member was mentioned, every cousin, every aunt, even her husband's siblings. But not me. I blinked at the screen. I scrolled up and down, thinking perhaps I had missed a message. But no, my name was not there. Not a single word about me attending, not even a casual mention of, "Dad might join." Confused, I went straight to Jessica. I called her, my heart hammering in my chest, not knowing if I was prepared for what she might say. When she picked up, her tone was light, cheerful, almost teasing. "Hey, Dad." "What's up?" she said. "Jessica, I saw the group chat the trip," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Am I not coming?" There was a pause on the other end, a tiny crack in her usually confident voice. Then she laughed, nervous, maybe even a little forced. "Oh, Dad," she said, and I could feel the words slicing straight through me. "You wouldn't enjoy it. More our vibe. You know, us adults, keeping things fun and exciting." I waited, hoping she would add something, anything to soften it. Maybe a joke, a reassurance. But instead, she said it. The words that made my stomach sink, made my hands tremble around the coffee cup, and made my heart feel as though it had been punched in slow motion. "You're kind of embarrassing, Dad." It was so casual, so dismissive, as though she had just commented on the weather. She didn't pause for a reaction, didn't ask how I felt, didn't seem to consider that I was standing there in my living room, trying not to let the cup slip from my hands. I felt every ounce of those words, the years of sacrifices, the countless times I had bent over backward for her, the nights I stayed awake worrying, the vacations I had taken just to make her happy. And suddenly, I realized they had all meant nothing to her. I didn't speak immediately. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, and I certainly didn't cry. I simply listened to the faint hum of the coffee maker and the distant traffic outside my window, letting the words settle into my bones. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a strange, hollow sort of disbelief, like someone had reached in and pulled a part of my soul out without asking. Embarrassing. I finally managed to whisper, not to challenge her, but to confirm what I had just heard. "Yes, Dad. You know, loud, old-fashioned, a little awkward," she said, almost casually. "It's nothing personal. We just want this trip to be fun. Light. You know." I did know. I had known for a long time, maybe longer than I wanted to admit. Over the years, I had noticed the little things. Her eye rolls when I made a joke, the sighs when I suggested a family dinner, the way she hurried through calls when I wanted to talk about anything that wasn't convenient for her. But I had always convinced myself it was normal, that everyone had their moods, that she was busy, that she was growing up. I had never imagined that she would go so far as to exclude me entirely from a vacation, calling me embarrassing as if that erased 3 decades of love and care. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wall. My mind was a tangle of memories and regrets. I thought about her childhood, how I had driven her to dance classes in the rain, how I had worked late nights to make sure she had the latest textbooks, the trips I had planned just to see her smile. I thought about the nights I stayed up, sick with worry over her health, over her friends, over every little decision she made that I knew could change the course of her life. And now, all of that effort, all of that care, seemed to vanish in a single sentence. I tried to recall the last time she had truly included me in something important. The last time she had looked at me and smiled with genuine gratitude, not just out of politeness. I came up empty-handed. She was married now, successful, confident, surrounded by friends and a life that didn't need me. And yet, I had always thought I mattered. I had assumed that my role as her father, the man who had sacrificed so much for her happiness, would always earn me at least a seat at her table. I found myself replaying our conversation over and over, dissecting every word, trying to understand how she could say such a thing without remorse. I remembered her tone, casual and almost amused, as if she had just commented on the weather, and I realized that it was not just the words themselves, but the ease with which she spoke them that hurt the most. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She didn't even consider that those words might cut me deeply. As the hours passed, I went through my old photos, snapshots of birthdays, vacations, graduations. There was one from the lake when she was 8, holding a fishing pole, grinning from ear to ear, and I could see in her eyes the pure joy of a child feeling safe and loved. Another from high school graduation, where she had thrown her cap in the air, and I had been standing behind her, smiling proudly, even though I was exhausted from the weeks of planning and preparation. I realized that those memories were mine alone now. They belonged to me. She didn't seem to value them, didn't even acknowledge their significance. By the time evening came, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't the peace of resolution, but the quiet of someone who has been deeply wounded and finally accepts the pain. I didn't cry, I didn't call her back, and I didn't demand an apology. I simply sat in the dim light of my living room, thinking about what this exclusion really meant. She wasn't just sending me a message about a trip. She was sending me a message about my place in her life. And the message was clear. I was optional, a background figure, an embarrassment. Yet, amid the hurt, a thought began to take root, a small, stubborn spark that refused to be snuffed out by words or dismissal. If she thought I was embarrassing, if she believed I had no right to be part of her life, then perhaps it was time to reconsider how I allowed myself to be treated. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from understanding one's own value. I thought about the years I had spent giving without asking for recognition, the countless times I had swallowed my pride to ensure she had everything she needed. I realized that love had blinded me to the fact that respect and appreciation were not guaranteed simply because I had given so much. I had assumed that my presence alone would matter, that my role as her father was enough to secure a place at her table. But it wasn't. And if I continued down that path, I would remain invisible, a silent victim of someone else's convenience. That night, as I went to bed, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not beg for inclusion, I would not plead for recognition, and I would not allow myself to be diminished any longer. I didn't know yet what form this would take, but I knew one thing for certain: things could no longer continue as they had. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt the first flicker of a plan forming, a realization that perhaps the power I had always assumed she held over me was not as absolute as she believed. She had judged me embarrassing, she had excluded me, and she had underestimated the depth of my patience, my wisdom, and my resolve. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel discarded. I felt a quiet, steady strength, the kind that comes from knowing your own worth and from understanding that love does not require humiliation. I didn't yet know how I would act, or when, or what the consequences would be, but I knew that my response would be something she did not expect, something that would make her reconsider the assumptions she had made about me, about my patience, and about the limits of a father's love. And in that quiet, dimly lit bedroom, with the sounds of the city humming outside and the memory of her words echoing in my mind, I made one final, silent vow. I would not react with anger. I would not plead. I would act with purpose, with patience, and with the kind of quiet authority that could only come from a lifetime of experience, sacrifice, and unwavering love. For now, I was still alone in my living room, my coffee long gone cold, but I was not defeated. I was only beginning to understand the true cost of being invisible in the life of someone you love, and how the balance of power could shift quietly, irrevocably, with a single, deliberate choice. After that evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over the words she had said. "You're kind of embarrassing, Dad." They echoed through my mind like a mantra I hadn't asked for. At first, I felt stunned, almost paralyzed. I had spent so many years thinking that love and care alone would secure my place in her life. And suddenly, I realized that my assumptions had been naive. She hadn't simply excluded me from a trip. She had excluded me from recognition, from respect, from the subtle acknowledgement that a parent hopes for after decades of sacrifice. I spent the next morning in a daze, going through my routine without much attention. Coffee, newspaper, a quick walk around the block, but nothing distracted me from the gnawing feeling of being invisible. Every step I took, I felt the weight of years of giving without receiving acknowledgement. I thought about all the small sacrifices that had become part of my life without much thought. I had spent countless hours at work, not for my own comfort, but to make sure she had every opportunity I could provide. I had skipped vacations, longed for purchases, and even personal indulgences, all so she could have what she wanted, what she needed. There were moments I had to suppress a quiet resentment, not against her, but against the world that demanded I provide endlessly without recognition. I remembered her school years, how I had worked double shifts to pay for her piano lessons and the summer camps she begged for. I remembered the nights I stayed awake, worrying about her grades, her friends, her health. Every worry I had carried, every anxious thought I had had about her future, I had carried alone. I didn't expect acknowledgement. I didn't expect thanks. I only expected that my love would be enough to keep our bond intact. I remembered her high school years, especially the time she wanted to go on a week-long trip with her friends, and I had given her the money without hesitation, even though I could barely spare it. I never complained. I had never asked for a share in her experiences because her happiness was my measure, and yet, here I was, decades later, and she dismissed me as if none of it mattered, as if every effort I had made had been wasted. It struck me that I had been operating under an illusion all these years, that my care, my presence, my sacrifices guaranteed me a place in her life. I thought that love was enough, but apparently it wasn't. I realized then that I had confused unconditional support with unconditional respect. One could give endlessly and still be seen as an inconvenience. One could offer everything and still be called embarrassing. I went through my financial records next, not out of spite, but to remind myself of the reality. For years, I had quietly supported her lifestyle. School fees, car payments, rent during college, and even contributions to her wedding. I had funded vacations, offered to help with her home, and even lent money for investments she wanted to pursue. I never demanded repayment, never asked for acknowledgement. It was my choice, my responsibility as her father. I didn't keep track to boast, but to remind myself of the weight of responsibility I had shouldered alone. I had always been the silent backbone of her life. I had worked late nights, driven long hours, and given without question. And now, the very person whose life I had dedicated myself to had deemed me too embarrassing to be part of a simple family trip. The irony was bitter. After decades of unconditional support, my presence was no longer considered valuable. I realized then that there was one thing she had always counted on me for. One thing that remained hers by default. A kind of invisible safety net. It wasn't a gift, or even something she could hold in her hands. It was the quiet financial and emotional support I had offered, the things she had assumed were permanent and unchangeable. I had signed loans for her home, helped with business investments, and ensured she never faced a problem she couldn't solve with money or advice. She had never questioned it, because she believed it would always be there, ready to save her when needed. That realization was sharp, cutting through the haze of hurt. I understood that my role in her life had been transactional, even if she didn't think of it in those terms. My presence, my money, my advice, they were assumed, taken for granted. And now, as she dismissed me, she assumed those things would continue, even without me being included in her life emotionally. That was her mistake. I thought back to all the times I had swallowed my pride, the moments I had put aside my own embarrassment, discomfort, and desires just to be there for her. I had attended events I didn't want to attend, tolerated people I didn't respect, and navigated situations that made me uncomfortable, all to ensure she had a smooth, happy life. And yet, here she was, labeling me embarrassing as if all of those choices never mattered. It was a painful clarity. But amid the hurt, a strange sense of resolve began to take shape. The first wave of shock faded, leaving a calm, deliberate clarity. I realized that anger would not serve me, nor would pleading or confrontation. I had spent my life giving freely, and now it was time to consider the boundaries of that giving. I had always believed that love required sacrifice, but I was beginning to understand that self-respect required limits. I began to assess my options quietly. I didn't want to act in anger, but I wanted her to understand that there were consequences to her dismissal. She had counted on my support, assuming it was unconditional, unquestioned, eternal. She had miscalculated. I could choose to continue providing, pretending that her words had not cut through me, or I could step back, reclaim some of the power I had unknowingly ceded over the years. I thought about the legal and financial levers I controlled. The co-signed loans, the pending investments, the lines of credit she assumed I would always cover. None of these were threats. I had always acted in good faith, but they were mine to manage. The realization was both unsettling and liberating. I had the ability to quietly, deliberately withdraw the support she had come to depend on. Not out of spite, but out of principle. Not as revenge, but as a statement of self-respect. As I considered this, I reflected on the broader picture of our relationship. It had never been just about money or material support. It had been about presence, attention, care. I had given my time, my energy, my very self, always assuming that love and patience would be enough to maintain a bond. But bonds, I now understood, required acknowledgement, respect, and a willingness to see the other person as valuable. She had failed in that regard. I spent the next few days in quiet reflection, reviewing the history of our relationship, assessing the reality of her attitude, and considering my own response. I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. I didn't even let my emotions dictate my actions. I simply observed, cataloged, and prepared. It was not a matter of anger. It was a matter of clarity. She had shown me where she stood, and now I was deciding where I would stand in response. In those quiet moments, I realized something fundamental: my love for her did not require humiliation. My presence did not require permission to be acknowledged. Respect was not something I had to beg for, and neither was gratitude. I had been giving blindly, assuming that care was enough, but now I knew that true care required boundaries. Without them, love could be taken for granted, dismissed, or misused. I also realized that I had been invisible for too long. Not entirely invisible. Of course, I was still present, still supporting, still involved, but invisible in terms of agency, influence, and recognition. She had always assumed that I would act, that I would provide, that I would save the day without complaint. That assumption, I understood, had to change. I began to map out the small, quiet ways I could assert that change. Not with anger, not with confrontation, not with loud declarations, but with calm, deliberate action, measured, purposeful, and unmistakable in its message. She had judged me embarrassing. She had excluded me. She had assumed my support was unending. It was time she understood that nothing in life was guaranteed, not even a father's patience. It was a strange, empowering feeling, this clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't simply reacting to the world around me. I was considering my own agency, my own power, my own dignity. And I realized that dignity was worth more than any vacation, more than any fleeting discomfort. She had discounted me, but I would not discount myself. And so I began to plan, not in detail, not yet, but in principle. I would withdraw what she assumed was permanent. I would create a consequence that was quiet, inescapable, and entirely my decision. I would do it without drama, without malice, and without raising my voice. She would come to understand that respect cannot be demanded, and that love does not require humiliation. I didn't rush. I observed. I reflected. I cataloged every instance where her assumptions had shown disregard for my feelings, where my contributions had been taken for granted, where my presence had been minimized. I made mental notes, understanding that the power I had accumulated over decades, quiet, patient, unassuming, was not gone. It was simply waiting for me to assert it. And as the days passed, the anger and hurt that had initially gripped me began to transform into resolve. I didn't feel triumphant, nor did I feel bitter. I felt focused, clear, and unshakable. She had made a choice, and now I was making mine. It would be deliberate, it would be dignified, and it would be entirely unexpected. By the end of the week, I had fully internalized the lesson that had been whispered through every slight, every sigh, every dismissive remark over the years. My love and my support were not obligations. They were privileges. And privileges, when taken for granted, could be withdrawn. I didn't yet know exactly how I would act. That would come later. But I knew one thing: the dynamic between us had changed irrevocably. She had underestimated me, misjudged my patience, and assumed my support would never be questioned. And for the first time, I understood that I had the power to show her, quietly and decisively, that assumption was wrong. And so, I waited, not with fear, not with anxiety, but with calm, measured awareness. I had seen the truth of our relationship, and I was prepared to act. The next steps would be deliberate, careful, and entirely under my control. She had called me embarrassing. She had excluded me, She had assumed my support. Now it was time for her to learn, in a way she would never forget, that love and respect are earned, not assumed, and that even a quiet father can assert the limits of his generosity. The days following my reflection passed quietly, almost eerily so. I went about my routine, tending to small chores around the house, mowing the lawn, paying bills, and running errands, all the while keeping my thoughts focused and deliberate. There was no anger left in me, no desperate need to prove anything. What remained was clarity, a calm, unwavering understanding that the situation demanded a measured response, not an impulsive one. I had spent my life reacting to emergencies, crises, and her immediate needs. But now, for the first time, I was in control. I was not responding to a child, or even a dependent adult. I was responding to a pattern that had been allowed to continue unchecked for years. My patience had been tested, my dignity ignored, and my presence minimized. And now, I was ready to assert it in the most powerful way I knew, quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly. I began with the practical matters. Over the years, I had quietly been her financial safety net. Loans co-signed, investments guaranteed, credit lines approved. She had counted on these as though they were extensions of herself. Not out of pride, but out of principle, I reviewed each one. I noted what was fully in my control, and what could be adjusted without legal complications, and what actions would have real consequences she could not ignore. It was not a matter of revenge. I didn't want to punish her in anger, and I didn't want to humiliate her out of malice. That would have been easy, but it would have undermined the quiet authority I had cultivated. No, this was a matter of principle. She had assumed that support, presence, and care were unlimited. She had labeled me embarrassing, yet assumed my assistance would always be available. She had underestimated me. That assumption needed correction, and the correction had to be quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable. I contacted my financial advisors, my lawyer, and the bank manager who had handled some of her co-signed loans. I didn't frame it as a confrontation. I framed it as a review of my own finances and obligations. I wanted to be certain of the legal boundaries, the timing, and the immediate impact of any adjustments I made. It was surprisingly simple to ensure that the support she counted on could be temporarily withheld without breaching any legal or ethical obligations. The realization filled me with a strange, calm satisfaction. I had power she hadn't considered, and it required nothing more than patience and discretion to wield. I spent hours mentally rehearsing my next steps. I imagined her reaction when she realized a loan she had assumed was guaranteed would not be funded. I imagined the moment she would call, panic rising in her voice, trying to understand why her expectations had been disrupted. And I imagined myself responding calmly, without raising my voice, without a hint of malice. Simply stating the truth: support is a privilege, not a guarantee, and respect is earned, not assumed. Each time I imagined the scenario, I felt a quiet thrill. It was not cruelty, it was validation. For decades, I had acted in good faith, giving without expectation of acknowledgement. Now, she would confront the reality of dependence she had assumed to be permanent, and it would teach her, subtly but effectively, a lesson about respect, consideration, and gratitude. I went over every detail multiple times. I reviewed the exact timelines of the loans and investments, double-checked the paperwork, and ensured that my actions could not be contested. Everything had to be precise. There could be no room for error, no way she could argue that I had acted impulsively. This had to be a measured, controlled response. That control was as important as the action itself. I also reviewed my own emotions carefully. I wanted to be certain that I was acting from clarity and principle, not from anger or revenge. Every time I felt a flash of resentment, I paused, inhaled, and reminded myself that this was not about punishment. It was about teaching a lesson through consequence, demonstrating that love and support were not unlimited, and that dismissiveness carried weight. I wanted her to feel the gravity of assuming my presence and resources were unconditional, without me ever raising my voice or losing my composure. When the time came to act, I did so quietly. I contacted the bank and arranged for the loan she was expecting to be temporarily suspended. I redirected funds that had been earmarked for a business investment she assumed I would cover. I reviewed each line of support she relied on and adjusted what was fully within my control. At no point did I make any announcements, send warnings, or dramatize my actions. It was a quiet, deliberate withdrawal, silent, effective, and unmistakable in its implications. After each adjustment, I sat back and breathed, noting the calm that accompanied each completed step. There was no rush, no need to celebrate, no thrill-seeking. This was deliberate, careful, and entirely under my control. She would discover the consequences soon enough, and it would not be a spectacle. It would be an undeniable fact. That fact would teach a lesson she could not ignore, and it would do so without me having to raise my voice, argue, or beg. I spent the evening reflecting on what I had done. I realized that for the first time in years, I had acted entirely for myself, guided by principle and clarity, rather than obligation or expectation. There was a power in that calm, deliberate agency, a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced from providing endless support. I was reclaiming the authority I had ceded unconsciously over decades, and I was doing it with quiet dignity. As I lay in bed that night, I reviewed the sequence of events in my mind. I visualized her reaction when she attempted to access resources she had taken for granted. I imagined the confusion, the panic, the frantic calls. I imagined her voice shifting from casual confidence to uncertainty, then desperation. And I imagined myself responding calmly, simply stating the truth. Your assumptions about my presence, my support, and my patience were mistaken. That calm certainty was more powerful than anger ever could be. I also reflected on my own boundaries and limitations. For too long, I had allowed her assumptions to dictate my actions, sacrificing my own comfort, pride, and dignity to maintain her happiness. Now, I understood that love and care did not require self-abnegation. Respect, acknowledgement, and consideration were necessary, and when absent, consequences were justified. This quiet assertion of principle was not cruelty. It was a long, overdue lesson in the balance of relationships. By the next morning, I had reviewed every aspect of my plan again. I had ensured that my actions were legally sound, ethically defensible, and emotionally precise. I had anticipated every possible reaction she might have and considered the appropriate response. I felt calm, prepared, and resolute. This was not impulsive. This was not reactive. This was deliberate, controlled, and entirely within my rights as a father and as an individual who had spent decades giving without recognition. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency I had long forgotten. I realized that my patience, my diligence, and my careful consideration over decades had given me a quiet power she had never anticipated. She had assumed that my love and support were unending and unquestionable. She had assumed that she could dismiss me and still rely on me. She had assumed I would act as she wished, regardless of her disrespect. And now, she was about to discover the reality. Assumptions could be challenged, and respect could not be demanded. I did not act immediately after my preparations. I waited, observing, knowing that timing was crucial. She had to discover the consequences organically, without my interference. That would ensure the lesson was clear and unforgettable. My patience, cultivated over years of sacrifice and quiet support, became my greatest asset. I had waited decades, and I could wait a few more days to ensure the impact was complete. In those quiet moments of reflection, I understood that this was not just about her. It was about me reclaiming the dignity, authority, and clarity that I had long ceded in the name of love. I had allowed her expectations and assumptions to dictate my life, to shape my actions, and to erode my sense of self-worth. Now, I was setting boundaries, asserting control, and demonstrating that even quiet patience has limits. The anticipation of her reaction, though carefully managed, was not unpleasant. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing that a lesson will be learned, a mistake will be corrected, and a truth will finally be understood. She would realize, in her own way, that respect and acknowledgement are not inherited, they are earned. And she would understand, for the first time, that even a quiet, patient father has limits. And so I waited, not with anxiety, not with anger, not with fear. I waited with calm awareness, knowing that the moment of revelation would come. She would encounter the consequences of her dismissal, her assumption, and her casual labeling of me as embarrassing. And when she did, I would be ready, not to argue, not to plead, not to scold, but simply to let the reality of her actions speak for itself. For the first time in a long time, I felt in complete control. The path was clear, the action deliberate, and the lesson inevitable. I had acted not in anger or revenge, but in principle, with quiet authority. She would soon understand that love without respect is a fragile thing, and that assumptions about patience and support are not guarantees. And as I sat alone in my living room that evening, watching the shadows lengthen across the walls, I felt a deep, steady calm. This was no longer about being included in a trip. This was about reclaiming my dignity, asserting my boundaries, and demonstrating, in the most quiet and deliberate way possible, that even the most patient father has limits, and that those limits, once reached, carry consequences that cannot be ignored. It didn't take long for the first signs to appear. I had done everything quietly, deliberately, without warning, without drama. But within hours, the first ripple reached me. An email notification from the bank regarding the loan she had assumed would be funded immediately. My heart didn't race. I simply read the message and noted the obvious: the funds would not be released as she expected. At first, I did nothing. I allowed her to discover it on her own. I could almost imagine her reaction: confusion, disbelief, denial. She had assumed, after all, that my support was automatic, unquestioned, inevitable. She had planned her vacation, her purchases, her investments, all under the assumption that I would always be there to back her up. That assumption was about to shatter. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen, and I could hear the subtle tremor in her voice before she even spoke. "Dad," she said, the casual tone I had become so used to replaced by something tight, strained, almost frantic. "I don't understand. The loan, the investment, everything is. Why?" I sat quietly in my chair, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above me, and let the words hang. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. The silence was heavy, deliberate, and it was mine to control. She stumbled over her words, trying to articulate confusion and disbelief at the same time. "Dad, seriously, what's going on? I counted on this. I needed this. You promised," she said, her voice rising slightly, teetering on the edge of panic. I inhaled slowly, keeping my tone calm, steady, and deliberate. "I understand that you assumed I would act," I said, "but assumptions are dangerous. You assumed my support was permanent. You assumed my presence, my patience, and my resources were unlimited. That assumption was mistaken." There was a pause, a sharp, strained silence on the line. I could almost hear her mind working furiously, trying to comprehend what she had taken for granted for so long. The panic, the fear of reality sinking in, was palpable even over the phone. You can't do this," she said finally, her voice tight with disbelief. "You promised. You've always. This isn't fair." I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. Not because I was gloating, but because I had expected this reaction. I had anticipated the disbelief, the desperation, the frantic need to restore the illusion she had relied on for so long. Fairness is subjective, Jessica, I said quietly. What is fair is not assuming that love and support are guarantees. What is fair is understanding that respect and acknowledgement are necessary in any relationship. Her breathing quickened. I don't understand. Why now? Why like this? I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my silence settle over her words. Because now, you see what happens when assumptions replace gratitude, I said. Because now, you realize that dismissiveness has consequences. Because now, you understand that a father's patience, support, and presence are not obligations. They are privileges. The line went quiet again. I could hear the faint sound of her moving around her apartment, probably pacing, probably grappling with the sudden collapse of the reality she had built on my quiet compliance. The sound was faint, but it was enough. I didn't interrupt. I didn't add another word. The silence itself was a lesson, a reflection of the boundaries she had never respected. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to, I didn't think. You didn't think, I repeated softly, letting the words sink in. You didn't consider my feelings. You didn't consider the years of care, the sacrifices, the quiet support you relied on. You dismissed me, you excluded me, and now you're seeing the consequences of that dismissal. Her voice cracked, shifting from disbelief to desperation. Dad, please. Can't we fix this? I need this. I need your help. I can't. I held the line steady, calm and unwavering. You can't assume support. You can't assume inclusion. You can't assume that dismissing me carries no consequences. You can, however, respect boundaries, acknowledge effort, and show consideration moving forward. That is your responsibility. That is what you have ignored. There was a long pause. I could almost feel the weight of her realization pressing through the line, suffocating, undeniable. She was quiet for longer than I expected, perhaps thinking, perhaps absorbing the consequences of a lifetime of assumptions. I didn't know. She whispered finally, almost a confession. I didn't think about it that way. I thought you'd always help. I didn't interrupt. I didn't soften. I had no intention of defending her assumptions or validating the expectation she had created for herself. You thought wrong? I said simply. That thought was your choice. And now, you see the reality of those choices. Her breathing was shallow. I could hear the panic in her voice, the scramble for solutions that didn't exist. She was learning, perhaps for the first time, that life does not always accommodate assumptions. That dependency without acknowledgement is fragile. That dismissiveness carries consequences. I can fix it, I can, she began, then faltered. The words hung, incomplete, as if she was realizing that the solution she wanted so badly was no longer automatic. You can, I said quietly. If you respect limits, if you value the support offered, and if you acknowledge the effort behind it, that is the only way forward. There was silence again, longer this time, almost reverent. I could feel the shift, the subtle change in her tone, her perception. She was beginning to understand. Not fully yet, but enough. Enough to see that her casual dismissal of me as embarrassing, her assumption that my support was guaranteed, had consequences she could not ignore. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and trembling. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to. I never realized. I let the apology hang in the air. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The weight of her words, the hesitation, the recognition of what she had taken for granted, was already teaching the lesson. I had no need to add drama to raise my voice. to force a reaction. The lesson was embedded in reality now. She paused, and I could hear her swallowing hard, the panic and disbelief giving way to reflection. I need to think. I need to understand. That is all I ask, I said softly. Take the time to understand, to recognize, and to respect. The rest will follow naturally. There was a long pause. I didn't push, didn't prompt, didn't fill the silence. I let her process, let her realize the scope of what had been assumed and what had now been challenged. And in that quiet, deliberate pause, I felt the full measure of the shift. For the first time in decades, the balance between us had changed. She had assumed, dismissed, and relied without consideration. Now, she faced the consequences quietly, inevitably, and entirely under my control. I did not feel satisfaction in cruelty. I felt satisfaction in clarity, in principle, in the assertion of dignity that had been absent for far too long. Finally, she whispered almost inaudibly, I understand, Dad. I understand now. I didn't reply immediately. I let her words linger, allowing the weight of the lesson to settle fully. Then, in a calm, steady voice, I said, Good. That is the beginning of understanding. Respect is earned, and consideration is necessary. Never forget that again. She remained silent for a moment, absorbing, processing, perhaps even reflecting on a lifetime of assumptions that had now been disrupted. I could sense the tension in her voice, the subtle panic giving way to reflection. It was the first time she had been forced to see me not as a perpetual safety net, but as a person with boundaries, authority, and dignity. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and breathed deeply. The silence in my house was profound, not oppressive, but filled with a quiet satisfaction. I had acted not in anger, but in principle. I had asserted boundaries not through confrontation, but through the undeniable force of consequence. I had taught a lesson without raising my voice, without dramatics, without malice, and I had done it with calm authority. For the first time in decades, I felt seen. Not for what I provided, but for who I was. Not for my money, my time, or my sacrifices, but for my dignity, my patience, and my ability to act deliberately when the moment demanded it. The lesson had been delivered. The shift in balance had occurred, and it was irreversible. As I sat in the quiet of my living room, watching the evening light fade through the blinds, I understood something fundamental. Love does not require humiliation, support does not require assumption, and respect is not inherited. It is earned. My daughter had finally begun to understand that lesson, and I had delivered it without anger, without confrontation, and without losing my own sense of self. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, I realized that the true power of patience and principle is not in what is said, but in what is done, and the consequences that follow speak louder than any argument ever could. The days after that phone call were quiet, but heavy with thought. Jessica didn't call again immediately, and I didn't prompt her. I wanted the lesson to settle in naturally. She needed time to process the consequences of her assumptions, the impact of dismissing someone who had given her so much, and the reality that love and support were privileges, not entitlements. In the silence, I reflected on the years, on the sacrifices, on the patience that had carried me through decades of giving without acknowledgement. I thought about the moments I had missed, because I prioritized her comfort over my own. The vacations I had skipped to pay for her activities. The long nights of work so she could live in a house she loved, attend schools she deserved, and pursue opportunities I could afford for her. I thought about the quiet pride I had always felt, knowing I was doing my duty as a father, even if no one noticed or thanked me, and I realized that pride was not diminished by her dismissal. It was strengthened by my ability to act with integrity, patience, and principle. In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle changes. Jessica started reaching out, not with the casual tone of entitlement, but with a new hesitancy, a cautious recognition that she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. The first email I received was carefully worded, a tentative acknowledgement of what had happened. Dad, I realize I may have taken your support for granted. I didn't understand how much I relied on you, or what it took to be there for me all these years. I didn't respond immediately. I allowed the words to settle, to be considered. I wanted her acknowledgement to come from genuine reflection, not a desire to restore her convenience. After some hours, I replied, not with anger or lecture, but with measured words that reflected my principles. Acknowledgement is the first step. Understanding takes time. Recognition of effort and respect for boundaries is the next. You cannot assume, you must observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. Her response came slowly over the next few days. Each message was thoughtful, cautious, almost reverent. She was learning to navigate a new reality, one where the safety net she had always assumed was permanent, had been removed, and she was forced to take responsibility for her expectations. I realized that this was the moment she would either embrace maturity or cling to entitlement. I chose to remain silent and let her find the answer herself. During this period, I reflected on the nature of parenthood. For decades, I had believed that love alone was sufficient to maintain a bond. I had assumed that the care, attention, and sacrifices I had offered would guarantee my place in her life. But love, I realized, was only part of the equation. Respect, recognition, and consideration were equally vital. Without them, even the deepest love could be taken for granted, dismissed, or minimized. The lesson was harsh, but necessary. I also reflected on myself. For too long, I had allowed my own identity to be defined by my role as a provider, as a caretaker, as someone whose worth was measured by the sacrifices he made. This experience had forced me to reclaim my dignity, to understand that boundaries were not weaknesses, and that even love has limits when disrespected. I felt a quiet satisfaction in the realization that patience, principle, and measured action could be more powerful than anger, confrontation, or impulsive retaliation. One evening, I received a call. It was Jessica. Her voice was soft, tentative, but there was a new humility in her tone. Dade, I want to apologize. I was wrong to assume, wrong to dismiss, and wrong to exclude you. I see now how much you've done, and I didn't realize what that meant. I'm sorry. I felt a wave of calm wash over me. Not triumph, not gloating, but a deep, steady acknowledgement that the lesson had been understood. I didn't interrupt her with lectures or explanations. I simply listened, allowing her words to express what she had discovered through consequence rather than argument. Thank you, I said finally, in a quiet, steady voice. That acknowledgement means more than any apology. Recognition of effort, respect for boundaries, and consideration for others, those are the things that sustain relationships. Never forget that. She paused, a long, thoughtful pause. I won't, Dad. I'll try to do better. I promise. I didn't ask for promises. Promises could be broken. But the sincerity in her tone, the careful choice of words, suggested a new awareness, a deeper understanding of the relationship she had taken for granted. That was all I needed. In the following weeks, life returned to a quiet rhythm. I continued my routines, tending to my home, my health, and my daily responsibilities. Jessica reached out occasionally, not demanding, not expecting, but genuinely seeking connection. Our conversations were different now, measured, respectful, and grounded in mutual acknowledgement. I realized that the quiet lesson I had delivered had shifted the dynamic between us permanently. She no longer assumed, no longer dismissed, no longer took for granted the presence, patience, or support of her father. I also reflected on the broader implications of the experience. How often had we all allowed assumptions, convenience, or entitlement to shape relationships? How often had we failed to recognize the quiet sacrifices, the patient support, and the steady presence of those who care for us most? The lesson was not just for Jessica, it was for me as well. It was a reminder that boundaries are essential, that self-respect is vital, and that love alone is insufficient when unaccompanied by acknowledgement and respect. One afternoon, I found myself reviewing the family photos I had collected over the years. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, and ordinary moments filled the walls and albums. Each image reminded me of the depth of care, the investment of time, and the quiet presence that had shaped her life. I realized that those moments, while often overlooked, were the foundation of a lifetime of support, and they deserved recognition. Not just from others, but from myself. I understood now that my value was not dependent on acknowledgement, but my dignity demanded boundaries. I could give, support, and love without diminishing myself, and I could expect respect in return. That understanding, that quiet assertion of principle, had changed the relationship between Jessica and me. It had restored balance, not through confrontation or anger, but through deliberate, principled action. In the evenings, I often sat alone, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred. I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that I had acted not out of malice, not out of revenge, but out of integrity and clarity. The lesson had been delivered, the boundaries established, and the relationship redefined. Jessica had learned, and I had reclaimed the dignity that had been overlooked for too long. When she returned from her vacation, there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. She approached me with genuine warmth, careful consideration, and a quiet respect that had been absent before. Our conversations were lighter, not because the tension had disappeared, but because the foundation of mutual acknowledgement and respect had been restored. I realized that this was the most profound gift I could offer her, the understanding that relationships thrive on principle, patience, and mutual regard, not on assumptions or entitlement. As I watched her navigate the consequences of her assumptions and emerge with a deeper understanding, I felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond pride or satisfaction. It was the calm assurance that integrity, patience, and deliberate action could shape not only immediate outcomes but lasting understanding. The lesson had been difficult, but it had been necessary, and it had been delivered with quiet authority rather than spectacle. I also reflected on the power of silence, of restraint, and of controlled action. How often do we respond in anger or frustration, seeking immediate validation or satisfaction? How often do we fail to recognize that the most enduring lessons are those delivered through consequence, patience, and principle? I had learned that even in love, in care, and in support, there is strength in quiet authority and power in deliberate, principled action. Finally, I understood that this experience had not diminished my love for Jessica. It had refined it. Love without boundaries can be taken for granted, but love tempered with respect, principle, and integrity fosters understanding, growth, and connection. She had learned, perhaps for the first time, that support is not infinite, that patience has limits, and that acknowledgement and respect are essential in any meaningful relationship. And as I sat in my living room one quiet evening, the light fading through the blinds, I felt a profound sense of closure. The lesson had been delivered. The relationship had been redefined, and the boundaries had been restored. I realized that the true measure of love is not in what is given without question, but in the balance of care, respect, and integrity. I didn't cancel her trip to hurt her. I didn't act to punish her. I acted to teach a lesson, to establish boundaries, and to reclaim the dignity that had been overlooked for too long. And in doing so, I had not only changed the way she saw me, but also the way she would navigate her own relationships in the future. For me, the result was profound. I had acted with principle, patience, and clarity. I had shown that respect cannot be assumed, that care cannot be taken for granted, and that even a quiet, patient father has limits. The lesson was irreversible, delivered with integrity, and understood through consequence rather than confrontation. And as I closed the day, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that love does not require humiliation, support does not demand assumption, and respect is not inherited. It is earned. That was the lesson I had delivered. That was the legacy I had reclaimed.